And my name is Aimée Craft. My day job is as an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, and the rest of the time I'm working in community on land and trying to be a good relative as part of creation. I'm so pleased to be here today with my amazing colleagues, each of whom has participated in previous conversations across the country as part of a webinar series hosted by the David Suzuki Foundation and other partners to engage a conversation about what land back means, what it can mean, what is important for us to know, and to start from a place of equality and information. Rachel Plotkin, who's joining us from David Suzuki Foundation, is one of the co-producers of the video, and I've had the pleasure of working with her in developing what we thought would be a good base for entering into the conversation, hearing a variety of perspectives on what land back is, because there is no one singular way of thinking about or acting on the land back movement. And Rachel is she's been with the foundation, David Suzuki Foundation, for 15 years. And before that, she worked at the Sierra Club of Canada. So I'm really happy that she's able to join us today and be part of this conversation. Normally I'd say to your left or to your right, but all of our screens are kind of in different time zone and different ways of being organized. But next I wanted to acknowledge Marilyn Baptiste, who is joining us from her home territory. And I'll encourage each of the speakers to add any bio notes that you'd like to, but she is, amongst many other things, the former chief of her nation that is one of the 6 nations that makes up the Tsilhqot'in Nation, and has been the recipient of a Goldman Environmental Prize for helping to shut down the Deseco Mine's New Prosperity Gold Copper Mine. And I know many of us were watching the efforts by your community and your nation and people like you, Marilyn, and have great admiration for that work on behalf of your people and also the land and water. We also are very pleased to welcome Doug White, who is also a former chief of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. So we have 2 former chiefs, but more importantly, leadership in a variety of different ways that are joining us today. So Doug, welcome. Doug is a practicing lawyer. He's a negotiator for First Nations across the country, currently the chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council, and has held a variety of different roles, always advocating for justice, recognition of treaty, and wellness of his nation and people as well. Danika, who's joining us, along with the life that she brings through her son, who we might see in the background, is joining us from Ottawa, where she's working currently as an assistant professor at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies. Danika is a Cree woman from the Ermineskin Cree Nation and has worked with a variety of Indigenous organizations nationally, including the Assembly of First Nations, and has worked at the international level, including with UNESCO as Vice President of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. And so we have an amazing panel of speakers here today. I want to acknowledge that this is being recorded, that the webinar is being recorded, and that we will be taking some questions from the audience. So if you do have questions and you want to direct them into the question and answers section of the webinar, that's in the bottom of your screen. And if there are things that you want to include in the chat, if you need some technical assistance, that can go into the chat box. So welcome. I hope everyone's had an opportunity to view the first 2 videos, which are about the past and present and how they figure into the longer conversation, the ongoing conversation about land back. And we'll watch together the 3rd video, which is about the future. And part of our discussion today is going to reflect on both past and present, but turn our gaze to the future and how we can engage collectively in bringing land back to the fore, in creating action and energy around land back as we journey forward together. So at this point, I think we can launch into that video, and then we'll engage each of the panelists in some discussion and then answer some questions, including yours. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll turn it over to our tech folks to help us with the viewing of the video. Miigwech.
Change is required for more just systems of land governance. What is the role of relationships and allyship in advancing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the concept of consent? How do we ensure that Indigenous peoples are included as decision makers in accordance with Indigenous systems and principles of governance?
We don't need to return to sort of a pre-contact society. That's not an Indigenous objective. I think that's often imposed on us by the outside, including Canadian courts, right? Like the idea that Aboriginal practices are supposed to stay static over time and that they are affirmed at some point. I mean, that's not the relationship we have with land. Every relationship evolves, and our relationship with land has to be one that accepts our modern circumstances as Indigenous people.
I put all of my hope into building relationships on the ground that are accountable and led by Indigenous people, and by working hard to build broad bases of support for Indigenous self-determination and Indigenous demands.
There's a concept, a word in Anishinaabe when we call Gwet'in. It's actually an agreement to work together. That agreement to work together is based on this premise that you're doing it for mutual well-being and not for individual interests and for the protection or the enhancement of private property as individual interests. Everybody thinks relationships are about them, and relationships are actually relational. We learn this as we participate in ceremonies. As Indigenous people, we walk into that space, and I think you need to think about that humble approach of not erasing who you are or what you have to bring, but also being in a respectful relationship where you say, here I am, how can I help, but not imposing an agenda either.
You know, when I think about what white allies can do is talk to other white people. And what I think what we need is for not necessarily for our communities to always have to engage in sort of 101, is that a lot of allies could actually do that, lift that burden for us. We're living it every day. We're engaged in this all the time. We're doing all of this work. Be in the street with us when we need to, ultimately. Because when you show up like that, it sends a message that no letter to your MP can actually do. And it's not that you shouldn't write letters, you should. Physically showing up is actually really important.
The capital of Canada is actually existing on unceded Algonquin lands. So a solution for me, at least, is that Canada should be paying a regular annual lease on those lands that are identified as still being Indigenous lands.
Where land has been sold and developed, well, pay rent. A tax on every economic transaction should go straight to the traditional caretakers, who should also guide all further development on that land according to their values.
I'd rather see the government just say, yes, we do not legally possess this land. Let's work out a lease arrangement for it. There should be an annual payment that allows First Nations to develop their societies, develop their governments, and develop the institutions they need to also help manage those lands.
I think every province has an opportunity to have significant conversations about what resource revenue sharing and Indigenous jurisdiction and Indigenous laws might look like, whether you're in a context of treaties, existing historic treaties, modern treaties, or if you're in areas where there's Aboriginal title. I think any type of Indigenous interest in territory, which exists everywhere in Canada, warrants those really important conversations about who benefits. If it means setting aside, protected areas. And then I think there's a really important role to play in terms of lobbying governments to engage in deeper processes of environmental evaluation that include Indigenous legal orders as part of how we evaluate impacts on environment.
I think the struggle Canada has with its own identity, with its own nationhood, is that it's the missing piece, which is it's never figured out the relationship with our communities, what that actually looks like, how to live in right relation with us, nation to nation. And yeah, that means we would be richer monetarily, like economically, than we are today, because we always should have been. What I ultimately think Canada is what it was before contact, which is a collective of nations, right? And so it's much closer to the European Union, or maybe it's modeled after like the Federation of Planets in Star Trek or something like that. I mean, I don't think those models are crazy, to be honest. Like getting somewhere like that, where we have a collective of governance.
One of the top things that people that love the land can do is think about how the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People can be given effect in a Canadian context, and having provinces not only commit notionally to the declaration, but thinking about how it's then implemented, how free, prior, and informed consent has to be the framework for reconciliation in Canada, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has told us.
What I'd like to usually advise people, though, municipal leaders, any political leaders, is identify a project that you can work on with Indigenous peoples as partners. Start there. Build those relationships towards sharing a common objective and looking to develop some expression of the Indigenous presence, historic and contemporary, in your region. And by doing that, you will develop relationships, you will develop a deeper understanding of the history of the Indigenous peoples in your area, and ultimately the kind of friendships that can help facilitate the deeper conversations around land issues and conservation issues and so forth.
In 50 years, how important is it to have people that have traditional and cultural knowledge about the land? And so we have to really build up and support Indigenous education systems.
A lot of people don't realize the value in learning language. It softens and changes your worldview to be more Indigenous, So it's like when I was learning the trees, I see the forest as a library now. Like, man, there's so much to learn.
In our language, love is one of the most common words that we use. It's in everything. Deh. That word deh is so common and throughout so many of our words. Because we have to love where we come from, this earth and everything in it.
Across the country, Indigenous people in every jurisdiction are working sometimes in invisible ways and sometimes in really spectacular ways when they end up on the front pages on blockades. But that work is being done on a daily basis in order to restore governance systems. That right to exercise governance over their lands is something that everybody can support on a daily basis across the country today.
Allies are great. What we actually need are accomplices.
This is an invitation for the future generations. This is an invitation, us extending our hand to say, like, this is a way forward that we feel that we need to take.
I love all of those words and learn something new every time I watch those films. So thank you to all of those who participated in sharing their ideas. Some really important messages there. Just a reminder to everyone that we're recording this session. Thank you for joining us, Miigwech. There are so many amazing people that are sharing about where they're joining us from across Turtle Island and beyond. So I made myself a little list as we were watching the video, as I was scrolling through the chat. We have folks from Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish, Lekwungen territories, some folks joining from Saskatoon, Treaty 3, Treaty 6, Treaty 1, Treaty 7 from Métis homelands, some from Songhees, Six Nations, Unama'ki on the East Coast, Rosa River, Manitoba, Arviat, Nunavut, Secwepemc territory, Blackfoot territory, and also Belgium, Molokai, and Australia. So thank you to all of you who are taking the time to acknowledge where you're joining us from and acknowledging the original occupants of those territories as the people who are responsible for those lands and waters that you call home and that you have the privilege of being able to live on. I wanted to start the conversation and maybe Doug, I'll ask you first to weigh in on what do you think people should be taking from these videos? You know, there's a series of 3 of them. We've just watched the 3rd. There's a lot of information there. And what do you think people should be taking away in terms of knowledge, but also thinking about action?
Thank you so much, Aimée, and thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this. Those videos are incredible. I think they're really fantastic. So many beautiful thoughts expressed through them and put together so well. I think that the moment that we're in this country is a unique one. There, often people talk about the time that they're in, and I think it's undoubtedly we're in a defining moment in our country's history with respect to Indigenous peoples and state relations. And this has been the product of many decades and even over a century of advocacy and work. And here in BC, where I'm from, Vancouver Island, it's really clear that the history of advocacy has always been about 2 main topics, 2 main issues that have animated the voice of Indigenous peoples. And one is around self-determination, and then the second one being about the relationship to our territory, or the land back issue. That's always been the project of our advocacy and our work. And it's been for many decades that our people have been fighting for and seeking to create the kind of a moment that we're in now. And we see the work is played out both in the legal pathway, when after 1951, I think it was from 1927 to 51, we were not, the Indian Act itself statutorily prohibited us from hiring lawyers to advocate for land rights. After 1951, the courts, the whole legal process opened up as a pathway for us to be able to be engaged in. And in part that started where I'm from in the Nanaimo and the White and Bob litigation about treaty rights and about the treaty right to hunt specifically. That case was about a simple issue, and it's this: was there in fact a treaty between the Snuneymuxw people and the Crown or not from 1854? Because that basic fact of history had been erased by the Crown and by Canada. A really remarkable set of historical relations going back, in the Snuneymuxw Treaty of 1854, the reason why there was a treaty created in the first place was because back then, the colony of Vancouver Island knew that if they were going to settle in a region, like in the Lekwungen people's part of the world, or if they were going to seek to exploit a resource like coal from my territory, which is what they wanted, they knew that they couldn't just proceed and do whatever they wanted until they had the right relationship with the Indigenous peoples. They had to get the consent of the Snuneymuxw people to access the resource, and only in accordance with our agreement and our terms. And so the oral history of the treaty from Snuneymuxw is simply that the Governor Douglas and his people came and they talk about coal with us. And we said, look, we can sell coal to you. We can do that. Let's figure that out. Let's proceed. And it became a consent-based relationship. Unfortunately, in BC, that was December 23rd, 1854, when the Nanaimo Treaty was made. That was the last instance of that pattern of behavior. For whatever reason, the Crown shifted away and said, we don't, you know what, Aboriginal title, we don't need to worry about it. Let's just pretend it doesn't exist, it doesn't matter. And it's that shifting into a pattern of denial that structured what in British Columbia history became one of the sort of the predominant questions of politics, which is the Indian land question, because Indigenous peoples were constantly standing up and advocating for their land rights in the face of that denial. So in the 1960s, Nanaimo went to court to answer that and to press for that basic question to be asked and answered by the court. Was there in fact a treaty? And the answer was yes, there was, and it continues to matter. Then in 1982, we've got the Constitution that constitutionally entrenches those treaty rights through Section 35. Later on, we have the UN Declaration that is a very supportive narrative of international minimum standards about proper state relations with Indigenous peoples, that you have to respect and implement their rights, their treaty and other constructive agreement rights, their land rights, their self-determination rights. When I became chief of Nanaimo in 2010, it was an amazing experience for me, having gone through law school and been a lawyer before, and knowing how precious the basic idea of the rule of law is to the Canadian legal system, the Canadian political system, that the Supreme Court talks about it as one of the bedrock principles of what Canada is. One of the most cherished values is the rule of law. For me to show up in 2010 as the chief of Nanaimo, knowing that we have a treaty from 1854, the Constitution from 1982, the Supreme Court of Canada decision from 1965. When I was the chief deep into the 21st century in 2010, my experience was one of continuing erasure of that history and denial of that history. I was astonished. I mean, until you sit in the position of being chief and really being responsible for all that's going on, you see the challenges. And so I fought hard, as all previous leaders did and other leaders of other nations have done, to ensure those rights are respected and implemented. And I came to a place over the course of my time as chief and in my advocacy and my work for my people, where I knew that I could make headway through fighting and going to court and strong politics and all of that. But I knew that there was there was an important ingredient missing when I really thought about the kind of world that I want to help to bring about for my own children and grandchildren. And it's simply this. The magical ingredient is that it's the people of Canada themselves that have to be engaged in these issues and understand them and care about them and lead the way for their politicians to follow and for the legal system to follow along a pathway of acknowledging that Indigenous peoples matter, that we want, that the way that our country is now currently is insufficient, is not right, it's not just, and that we know that together, if we work together to create the fundamental shifts that are necessary to get Indigenous peoples in the right relationship with their lands, that this is not something that is threatening to the people of Canada. It's in fact an imperative that we're all under. And it's a space premised on deep respect and recognition and mutuality of each other, where we're in a relationship not of tolerance, but one that's premised on the basic idea of real concern for each other's well-being. Sort of an altruistic love is the framework of the relationship, where my heart and my mind are turned toward your well-being. Not just tolerating you, but actually being actively concerned about how you are. And so this is why when I think about the video that we've just seen and the other videos that go along with it and the moment that we're in and the fact that people are turning their minds to these issues, it gives me a lot of hope, because it truly is in the Canadian people themselves to lead this moment and to get it right. It's an imperative for all of us. And so I applaud everyone that's doing the important work and being involved and engaged in this. So Aimée, that for me, those are the things that come to mind. I think it's great work that's being done, and I think it's a beautiful, transformative moment that's full of potential and opportunity for us all to craft a different reality for our children and grandchildren, one that's better one that's just. So look forward to the discussion very much, and thank you for that opportunity to provide some reflections at this point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Doug. And I think, you know, what you're referring to as this desire to be in a context of mutual well-being is so important. And that's a foundation for many of our Indigenous laws and governance systems, and have been over time, right? And that's also what translates into our relationship with our lands and territories and waters, is that idea of creating spaces of mutual well-being that include not only humans, but the rest of creation as well. And I know that's something that, Marilyn, you've advocated for so stringently in your career and in your lifetime. And you know, how do you think people should be reacting to what they've heard and acting upon it? What do you think people need to take away from this conversation, from the videos that we've seen?
Thank you, Aimée. Also very honored to be a part of this panel and joining all of you in this long overdue discussion. And Land Back, those videos are it. When I first saw those, I mean, I thought perhaps I went to heaven. So I'm very, very grateful to be a part of this. And as I always say, it's about going back to the basics. You know, and when I come from the interior of BC, what is known as BC, and the snow mountains of Gwet'in territory, where the Gwet'in people, we have never entered into a treaty, as Doug's people have. But you go back to the 1864, the Chilcotin War, and that is a part of that treaty, so to speak, and that understanding where our people were upholding our duties and our responsibilities to protect the lands and the waters, and that's what it is for all of us. And a part of that relationship building obviously didn't, you know, start off on the right foot. And they then, back then, again, the governments, the newcomers, they were after gold. And then, you know, I can simply almost repeat Doug's story in that when I served as chief in my community, it was about, you know, protecting the lands against mining again in 2010. In 2008 to 2013 was a part of my work there. And even previous to me, since before I was born, my late dad was chief, and he fought against hydroelectric dams being proposed in our territory. So, you know, it's those relationships. And apparently governments didn't have that vision of that true relationship and working with our people. As Doug noted, you know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the free, prior, and informed consent is about creating those relationships and about truly understanding and working with people of the land. And because in the videos, in the past video, as noted, and for many people who may not understand, back to the basics is we were here. We didn't all of a sudden just appear or come here from somewhere else. We Indigenous peoples were here on Turtle Island since before contact. So for me, it's about, you know, all those, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. It's about educating ourselves. I also had to educate myself in all of my life. So that's, and it's been amazing and a rich journey, and being able to walk with our elders, learning from our elders and our children, as well as learning from elders and people across Canada, and as well as many other people from all walks of life around the world. And it is about, you know, protecting the lands and the waters, and, you know, maintaining that relationship so that we can pass it on to our great grandchildren who we will never meet.
Thanks for that reminder, Marilyn, about why we're doing this, right? That's for future generations and those young people that are to come, that we may not know at this point in time, but we have to envision a future for them like our ancestors did. And I know that some of you might be wondering, Danika isn't able to continue in the conversation with us. She has a family obligation, but I do want to reflect that in the past, she's brought that up, that importance, and now she's looking after her young one who's immediately there, right? And taking care of her family. And that's a large part of our obligations to land, territories, water is acknowledging those relationships. And I know that in past webinars on land back, Danika has really reinforced that treaty relationship, the importance of reviving, breathing life into the treaty relationship, educating ourselves and educating others, like you've mentioned, Marilyn, and understanding that there are different contexts across the country in which land back is mutually supportive on those bases that Doug, you've invoked in terms of, you know, that relationship with land, the self-determination of Indigenous people as those key foundations and key pillars to understanding how we need to rethink that relationship going forward. I wanted to maybe turn now to Rachel, and you've been directly involved in creating these films with a brilliant team. We've had Res Fresh, working with them was a lot of fun. And what do you think people should be taking from the information that's been shared and some of the discussions that you've been engaged with since, with people that are directly engaging?
Thanks, Aimée. And like the other panelists, I want to express just how deeply honored I am to be on this panel with such amazing people. I think I also love watching the videos because I find they have so many golden nuggets that I never tire of hearing. And I've learned so much already from the people who participated in the videos and the people who participated in the webinars. And one of the things that I take seriously is Candace's framing of it as an invitation, that the conversations are an invitation. And I hope if folks didn't get a chance to watch the other two videos, that they do find the time. There is a lot to learn. The first video is about the past and Canada's colonialist history of taking land from the Indigenous people. And I think this has come up already, but in the work that I do, it adds to the levels of poor governance of our lands. I think the resource extractionist economy that has been built in Canada and the policies that surround it, they're not working. And I've worked a lot on caribou in my 20 years as an environmentalist. And one example is that there's a herd in Alberta called the Little Smoky herd that has been managed by the province, but also, you know, the federal government does have oversight. And in that caribou range, there's over 97% industrial disturbance. So I like Doug, I really think there's an opportunity that we need to redo in Canada the way that we govern our lands and waters. And I take to heart a lot of the framing from the videos, Tim Johnson's expression of friendship and Isaac Murdoch's and Doug's talk about, you know, love for the world and love for each other. And I really think it's an opportunity to share in the ultimately positive experience of building a better world with better governance systems.
So building on that, part of what we heard in the video was a reference to, through Jesse Wente, not, to not being only allies, but accomplices. I think you probably fit in the category of accomplice. And, what do you think the distinction is? What do you think is the importance of being an accomplice rather than an ally? And what do you think accomplices and allies might actually contribute to the land back movement?
Thanks, Aimée. I think I take a lot of direction from one of Sherry Pasternak's comments, which is that you look at Canada's colonial history, and those of us participating in this call, we weren't there for the original land theft, but most of us on this call have benefited from Canada's colonialist structure. And therefore we have a responsibility to engage in writing that and in leaning into building a better world with our Indigenous colleagues, or at the very least a better Canada. So there's what Sherry says is that we don't have to feel guilt, but we do have a sense of responsibility. And I think that one of the things that you talk about, Aimée, is just the idea of how it's relational. So one of the models that DSF aspires to work on is that we go to our Indigenous colleagues and we ask, you know, what are ways that we can support you? And we listen and we learn, but also that we act. And I think that that is what Jesse is talking about is, you know, as an accomplice, you're someone who's not just listening or watching a video, but finding projects that you can do, which is something that Tim speaks to. And I think that can be on any level. Like I've talked to cottagers who talk about the wild rice conflicts in their cottage areas. And they could create like a cottage movement, you know, that says we support wild rice establishment. Or, you know, Tim has talked about things at the municipal level. And there's also a real need for political pressure, as Doug said, at the provincial and federal levels to change policies. So I think that I've always been an advocate of activism. I really believe in that we have responsibility to make the world a better place. And I think that there's just so many different avenues that people can explore, and that they start with relationships. And that, as Tim said, those relationships can lead to friendships. And it's a really fruitful space as an activist.
Doug, do you want to build on that in terms of, you know, how this redefined relationship, as you've suggested it might be, you know, what would that look like, and what's the role for each of the different players within that?
Very important question. And I love that question about the difference between ally and accomplice. That's a good one. I guess accomplice is sort of in a criminal context, isn't it? Is where it generally is used. It's like a complete unity of purpose, right? Where you're really in it together. You're taking risks together, and you're seeking rewards together, I guess. But you know, the work. Like I'm the chief negotiator for the Lake Babine Nation in the middle part of sort of central British Columbia, northern British Columbia, and we've developed an approach of working through the negotiations for self-determination and the implementation of Aboriginal title. And this is very, you know, I mean, the strength of the work is really built upon the Chilcotin Nation decision. I really want to acknowledge Marilyn, Baptiste, and her people for the really, 25 years of work that they did in the courts, all the way through up to the Supreme Court of Canada, to get to that decision, and that decision being built upon the 4 decades of Aboriginal title litigation in the country. And it's really in that decision where the reality of Aboriginal title and what it means, that it's the scope of it, that it's territorial in scope, and that there's decision-making power associated with it. It really raises for, and the Supreme Court acknowledged this in their decision. It wasn't really squarely part of the decision itself, but they sort of talked about and addressed what are the implications of this decision for our country. And they talked about, you know, so what does this mean now, and how does it need to change, or what should the changes be in terms of the behaviors of government in response to the Chilcotin Nation decision on Aboriginal title? Because if there's, you know, so the theory, the legal story about Aboriginal titles, that it came into shape in 1846, and it's always been there, and the Crown has acted as if it's not in BC. And but now we've got to grapple with the reality of it. And what they talked about, they really quickly went to the idea of consent. And I want to just sort of really quickly, in my part of my, I'll try and be brief here. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the duty to consult and accommodate that came from the Haida Nation decision in 2004 in the Supreme Court. It's important to know that that decision was transformative in the sense that before that decision, Indigenous peoples were they were not even in the room in terms of decision making. They were just ignored. The Crown's theory was that they could do whatever they want. They're unconstrained by the thought of potential Aboriginal rights or title. Until those things are proven in court or by a treaty, they don't have to pay any attention to them. They will do whatever they want. Haida Nation came along in 2004 and said, that's not the right approach. You've got to engage with and consult with Indigenous peoples prior to making decisions. But it's important to know, though, that the model of relations was firmly rooted in the idea in Haida Nation that there is only one decision maker in this country, and that is the Crown. There is no other decision maker. And as part of the Crown's decision-making process, it needs to go and engage with Indigenous peoples, do the consultation, but then it goes back and it makes its decision. In the Chilcotin Nation, it's really different, because what Chilcotin Nation says is that there's more than one decision maker. And so the court grappled with that, and they said, okay, what is the implication of this? And the most powerful one that they talked about, at least I think is like 13 times they talk about consent, is consent. Is that this means that you have to shift into a paradigm of consent-based relations with respect to decision making. And I think it really all leads back to a basic proposition that we've got to work on and develop a notion of cooperative federalism in this country that is firmly rooted in the recognition and implementation of Aboriginal rights and title and proper respect for treaty and treaty-based authorities and jurisdiction. And it will be a significant shift. It's an imperative now. It's a requirement for us to sort this out. So I really do think that, you know, when we're in BC, we have the DRIPA Act. Federally, they're considering another UNDRIP Act. These will necessarily require us to rethink the proper relations. You know, we come from a country, Canada's born out of a duality or a multiplicity or whatever, or a pluralism, where there's the Canadian and the French traditions are both represented at the foundation of Canada. So there's something already there in the country of a recognition that there can be more than one identity, and that we can have distinction but still function together. This is sort of like, I think we're at a point now where we have to evolve to the next iteration of Canada that properly includes Indigenous peoples, that respects them. When we think about the two-row wampum analogy or description of how we need to be, that we're on a same path, we're on a parallel path where everybody matters, and that we've got to coordinate and work out a new form of federalism. And so I think that inevitably will be a place where we go and where we need to go, and that we have to grapple with.
Absolutely. And I think what you're saying, Doug, in terms of decision making and not just looking at Indigenous knowledges as ways of validating decisions made by others, but having seats at the table, or I actually think changing the tables. Like, I've had elders say to the federal court, you know, come to our house. Like, we come to yours all the time. You come to our house. Come and be in our space. Come and see how we make decisions, see how we govern ourselves, what our laws are about. This is not just a shift in worldview or forms of knowledge or informational content. This is about a different way of proceeding. And, you know, today it was just announced, I was given the responsibility to carry a research chair on Nibi-Minwa-Ki, so land and governance and laws relating to and in relationship with land and water. And that's a really important part of how that's framed, is in relationship. The governance and laws that are in relationship with land and water, they're not about something that's external to us. It's about our relations with them, and how, when we make decisions, that we make them in relationship with. And I think that, you know, that's part of, you know, your background, Marilyn, in terms of the fight on Testico mines and the establishment of the Desco Tribal Park, and how you've looked at this and how you've worked with, you know, what may not have been allies, natural allies in the past, or accomplices, but how you've been able to kind of carry that advocacy and take on that responsibility for your land in very constructive and instructive ways. I know many of us were watching what you were doing with a lot of respect. And I don't know if you have any reflections to add on that, or, you know, decision making like Doug's introduced, or the idea of allies and accomplices.
Yeah, where to start? Wow. I would say that, of course, with allies and accomplices, you know, we've always had many allies that have worked with us alongside of us, who are probably more so accomplices in the sense of assisting in many different ways to get that education out there to the general public. That was one of the things that I find is very difficult for all Indigenous peoples, because even in the media that is supposed to be neutral and carry everyone's voices, it's a fight to actually get our real voices out there. So with allies, even if you're not right into the thick of things like Rachel and the accomplice end of things, even to help educate other people to simply, and in your educating of yourself and educating other people who may not understand. Even if you don't come to that full understanding, at least you're helping to, share the voices of the people from the lands. And that is one of the biggest fights I think that we have in the first place, as we have always been seen as savages and non-human. And that's where this colonial contact comes from, right? Is that we were not visible or here on our land, so they assumed that they could take that land. So now, I mean, in this process, as Doug mentioned, how many court cases across BC alone, and how many court cases across Canada, Indigenous wins, and look at the government, even with the Typhoon title case. What is that implementation? Where is it actually really at? It's in their negotiation. And one of the comments, about the consultation, or the so-called consultation, that consultation, as Doug noted, was a huge win from the Haida case. And so the government and industry could no longer just continue business as usual. However, they're always finding ways to simply check the box of consultation. That is, again, one of our big fights, to be able to get our voice out there, be involved in those decision-making on the land, with the land and the waters. So it's like we need everyone to be able to hold government accountable. And a lot of this stuff has been, with our allies writing letters to governments, to politicians, and when we're on roadblock or we're in those kinds of situations, that comes to a head. Why does it have to be like that after all of these court cases, these court wins? And the Typhoon Nation went to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Haida, the Delgamu, all these cases that are huge wins, and yet we're still fighting with governments for that recognition and that honorable relationship. Whereas with industry, if they need something, it's an instant omnibus, it's pushed through, it's happening on the ground, it's implemented, whereas court cases are not implemented. So how do we hold governments accountable to implement these things? How do we, and a lot of people want to know, how do we help as allies or accomplices, whatever you choose to be, is talking to your, I guess, government, the people in your area, writing to the Prime Minister, and being out there. Or even if you can't be there on the line, like down in the South, I want to be down on the front lines, but I can't be there physically. So, being able to just be there in spirit and talk about it to other people, and share those, those understandings, and further educate other people. That would be a part of it.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of dimensions to what you're saying, Marilyn, in terms of, even in the Tzolk'in decision, the Supreme Court is saying, the doctrine of terra nullius never applied in Canada, but then goes on to decide basically on a framework that's constructed around the idea that Canada was discovered and that it was open to be discovered because it was terra nullius. And those things kind of underpin the current legal landscape in Canada. And there's a lot of deconstructing to do around that. And you know, we can take stabs at it in a variety of different ways, but in some ways, I think what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was asking Canada and all of us to do is to not kind of tinker at the edges, but to go to the heart of it and dispel those doctrines, to create a new royal proclamation to honor treaties that exist already, that are meant to be agreements about mutual coexistence within territories. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission says our framework for understanding reconciliation in Canada has to be the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is an instrument that is about recognizing Indigenous human rights, right? And I mean, I would challenge anyone on this call to say that you're against human rights for Indigenous people. I mean, that's at its very basic core what UNDRIP is about. And that stands in contrast with, you know, some of the consent, the application of the laws of consultation and accommodation in Canada. You know, it's grasping at free, prior, and informed consent and self-determination at the center of how we think about Indigenous relations to lands and territories. So, you know, maybe each of you can answer this in the way that you want, but what do you think the role of UNDRIP and reconciliation and self-determination is in responding to or understanding what land back actually means for yourself and for your nations and communities? Maybe Doug, let's start with you. I've heard you many times speak about the importance of UNDRIP, but also some other action that needs to take place. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. A really important question. And I think the UN Declaration, TRC, importantly called for Canada to embrace it as a framework for reconciliation for the country. And this is obviously important because in part, or one of the main purposes why it's important, is that there is no domestic tradition in our country of recognition and respect of Aboriginal rights and treaty rights of Aboriginal title. All of the apparatus of Canada, the legal regimes, the political patterns of behavior, everything's premised on the idea that this stuff just doesn't matter. And so we're in a pretty bad spot. We're in a rough spot in terms of, it's a huge distance to go from the status quo to where we need to get to. And so because the UN Declaration is a comprehensive framework of minimum standards that should exist between a state and Indigenous peoples, it's an important marker or set of guidelines, or however you want to describe it, set of principles and ideas and standards that need to apply. Now, you know, in terms of land back, you know, at the core, the way that I think about the UN Declaration is that there's three main things to it. One is a collective right to self-determination. Two is that collective's right to have its land, its territory. And then three is the minimum standard, the human rights standards that need to apply. So it's I think of UNDRIP as a bit of a hybrid international instrument that addresses both individual human rights, but also collective rights. And I know that in the development of the UN Declaration, there was a big tension between those two things as it was being negotiated and worked on. And so I think it does have to be understood as doing both things, and it needs to, right? I mean, Indigenous peoples are in different situations all around the world, and for some, basic human rights are, you know, very urgent and essential, as they are here in Canada. But now, so in terms of the land back narrative and story, like here in BC, we've always been talking about the need to have Aboriginal title respected and implemented. And it's been a major focus of the work. You know, and so UNDRIP being supportive of that, is essential. Like here in BC, we have the UN Declaration Act. They call it the DRIPA Act, that was put in place just over a year ago. And it has a freestanding sort of law or provision that says that BC must take every measure to ensure that the laws of British Columbia are in alignment with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is going to be significant work, very important work to be done when you consider and realize that every single provincial law is premised on the idea that Aboriginal title doesn't exist or doesn't matter. You can see how deeply embedded denial is in the legal regime of British Columbia. And so now this important UNDRIP amounts to an important instance of beginning that shift and that move away from denial towards recognition. So I think it can be, we have the law that we need in Canada. We've got, I know that Indigenous peoples consider themselves sovereign. They know about their Indigenous legal orders and traditions, that they've always been there. They continue to carry on, and they will carry on into the future. And so UNDRIP, I think, is a very important supporting narrative, political instrument and legal instrument that should buttress and support the work that's being done by Indigenous peoples here in Canada. So those are some of my thoughts, Aimée, that off the top of my head in response to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful in, thinking that this is not something that belongs to one or the other. I mean, this is really about collectively working towards something. And in many ways, a lot of people are confused by land back and think that this is about conflict. And I think everything I'm hearing from each of you is not about conflict. It's actually about mutual recognition and working together towards something that is a common goal. Marilyn, what are your thoughts on UNDRIP and ideas around self-determination and consent and relationships with land in those frameworks and reconciliation?
Well, of course, in my educating myself on that, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that was a long process that was Indigenous peoples working on this around the world, right? So, and those are minimum standards, international standards that are, to me, it's like a guide there for holding governments and industry accountable to our rights as Indigenous peoples. It also is, it's for us as a people, which we are already doing, living on the lands and upholding our duties and responsibilities to protect the lands and waters. And that those international standards are there to, in a sense, for me, it's like protect us in our work where we are protecting Mother Earth for our future generations. But when you take it to governments such as Canada and BC, for example, yes, we're very thankful that Canada has finally signed on, and they are looking at adopting that through a legislation. The scary part and the question that all Indigenous peoples across Canada are looking at and asking is how much of that United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are being changed for the sake of government and industry. I would like to be able to see that. How much of that is actually being changed before they adopt it through legislation? How many times, as you know, how many these things go through the House, how many times? And then you look at BC in DRIPA. They have adopted DRIPA rather than the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. How much of that has been changed for the sake of BC's interests and industry's interests. As noted by Jillian here, the BC NDP is, they might have adopted DRIPA, but they're still looking to, have arrests made at Fairy Creek today as we speak. And so how is that working in a respectful relationship with Indigenous peoples who are standing up and protecting the lands and the waters? It's not. It's lip service as we all know it, as we see it. And so I think one of the things that we need to be able to do, as all Indigenous peoples are striving and continuing to do, is standing strong in our territories and passing on our language and our cultures to our children. And a part of that is also helping our allies and all other peoples, as well as government and industry, to understand who we are, where we are, and where we come from. And, if you're going to enter our territories, you need to work with us first. You need to speak to us first. And the big thing in all of this imposed colonial government system and the Indian Act, the dangers as we've seen across Canada, probably around the world, is when the colonial governments are writing their own doctrine of discovery, the terra nullius, it's their foreign systems they're imposing on us. And they change it, they rewrite it for their benefits. And it's not in that respectful relationship for the good of all, as Doug speaks to so well. It's about that work and that honest relationships that our elders teach us everywhere. It's for the good of all. It's not just for the good of myself, right? And I think that's a big part of what Land Back is all about. And I think when a lot of our people hear these videos with Land Back, it'll be like, yes, let's take our land back, because of what we've been through, because of the injustices that our people have lived and suffered, and our children still are being traumatized through those injustices. But yet, as we're taught from our elders and our people, is we're strong, we're Indigenous people, and we will continue to stand up, and we will continue to protect our lands and our waters. We're not going anywhere. If all other people and governments are not going anywhere, you need to work with Indigenous peoples. It's the bottom line. It's that simple.
Thanks, Marilyn. And I think that a lot of the folks in the webinar here are echoing a lot of these thoughts and asking really deep questions about what land back means, what reconciliation means, and these are beginnings of conversations, and by no means do we all collectively on this webinar have all of the answers. It's something that we're going to have to work through and work on. Hopefully those of you who have asked some questions can see that I'm trying to weave together some of the questions in ways that will hopefully answer as many of your questions as possible. And one of them is about land back at the link with climate justice. And I'm hoping that, Rachel, you're prepared to take on, the answer to that question about reconciliation, land back, and UNDRIP in the context of climate justice. And that will probably take us to our closing question or closing remarks from each of our panelists today. While Rachel is sharing with us, I'd encourage Doug and Marilyn to maybe scroll through some of the comments and the questions and see if there are things that you want to pick up on in your final remarks when we have an opportunity to turn to those. And maybe think about also briefly summarizing, what are your hopes and aspirations and predictions for the next 10 and 50 and 100 years, which is how we think as Indigenous people about that future that we've all spoken about. So Rachel, land back, climate justice, what do you think is the link?
Well, there's very strong links. Part of climate justice is related to policy changes and stopping carbon pollution. And then something that a lot of people are starting to talk about more is nature-based solutions. So the fact that having healthy lands and waters actually sequesters and stores carbon. And I think it all does tie back into the themes that we've talked about today. One of the things in my own work, one of the things that I like is that it's changed. Like maybe 8 years ago, I was campaigning to support Indigenous-led conservation in protected areas. And part of the idea for this webinar and this project grew out of the recognition that we want to support more than just protected areas. We want to support land governance. And one of the things I really liked from the conversation today is how we keep pushing the envelope and how there's so much change. And it really makes me look forward to the future in terms of a participant in reconciliation to the extent that I, as one person in my work and in my personal life, can do. But I really like that, I used to say that for me, if I had to simplify the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and free, prior, and informed consent, it would be about having Indigenous people at decision-making tables. And then I think, today we've said, well, those tables aren't the right tables. Like, let's change the tables. And then I think we even got to ditch the tables. Like, let's have meals, or let's have a different way for decision-making. So I think that our search for both environmental and social justice are deeply, deeply entwined. And I know that a lot of people who joined this webinar, were reached through the David Suzuki network. So they obviously have an interest in conservation and environmental issues. And I hope that they can also twin those with social justice issues and becoming active participants in advancing land back.
Thank you, Rachel. Marilyn, do you want to share some of your closing thoughts? This has been an incredibly rich discussion. I wish we could spend the next 10 days out on the land. I'd invite you all to my home territory. We'd go sit by the water, make a fire, make some tea, hash this stuff out, maybe have a good laugh, and maybe have some tears, right? That's all part of healing with land, on the land, and being in our own spaces. So I'm grateful that we've been able to do this in this format, but I actually will commit to extending the invitation to you to come and have that conversation. I would really appreciate that one day that we have the opportunity to do that. Do you have anything that you would like to share, Marilyn, in closing? And go ahead.
I second the next 10 days of discussion. But no, definitely. I mean, this is, as I said in the beginning, it's long overdue. And those videos were so well put together. I'm very thankful for those. And it's like Candace said in those videos, so many people talk about my rights, but it is my responsibility. And so how can I help as a part of my responsibility, part of sharing and helping people to learn? And some of the things, reflecting on how in-depth Doug is able to share, and I really appreciate that. And I think if you look at some of the discussions that I've been hearing is, the white paper policy from the governments of wiping out the Indigenous peoples across this land needs to be replaced with a red paper. That is some of the discussion, and that United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples could be that red paper. And it's about building those relationships and working together so that we are protecting our lands and the waters. And, I just love being able to say that over and over and over, because I'm sure somebody has heard me, and we all know that as well. But a part of that too is, you know, how people talk about how are we going to transition from all this fossil fuels and all this extraction. I think a big part of it, and I don't know all of the answers, but when you sit down, you talk to our elders and our people, it's about going back to the basics. If you go back to the basics and you eat from your area, that's a part of food sovereignty for all of us. It doesn't matter who we are. It's a part of our health. And the better we can take care of our health, the better we can take care of Mother Earth. And, you know, they say technology is supposed to be able to help us to do things better. And like we are, as somebody noted, we are connected here because of technology. We're able to connect on this webinar from all over the place. And so how do we look at that? Part of that is recycling. And that's something that not everybody, most people take for granted. And that's a part of it. And when you recycle your thoughts and you think about land back, it's about, as noted in those videos, it's about me being able to connect to my land, to the waters, to appreciate it and to actually take care of it. There's a beginning, and then that's a continuity throughout for all time. And it is for the good of all, for my grandbabies and for me to help them learn that responsibility, and to help everyone else learn that responsibility. I thank you, and I thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And it's interesting that you mentioned a red paper, because I'll just give a shout out to my colleagues at the Yellowhead Institute. They have a great report called Land Back, and they've called it the red paper. It's a very insightful piece of work, and it's grounded in community examples. They also just recently released a report called Cash Back. And so that's their commentary on extractivism and you know, how that has been at the expense of Indigenous people. And so I would really recommend those two pieces of learning and engaging with some of these ideas. Rachel, any closing thoughts?
I was also going to recommend Cash Back. I just finished reading it today. I just want to say, in terms of the relationship part, one of the times I first met Aimée, I asked her about a white paper, and she said, I don't know if that's the best word for it in terms of this discussion. And so to just recognize that the opportunities ahead are wonderful, and that relationships always have some bumps, and to not be afraid to make mistakes, that there is learning in mistakes. And that's where the reward is.
Rachel. Doug?
Yeah, thank you, Aimée, and thank you everyone so much for the opportunity to be a part of this. It's always challenging having a conversation with about 1,000 people, but it's, you know, what a welcome challenge and opportunity. I've been trying to take a look at the various comments and questions, and I want to just start by talking a little bit about what Aimée first raised with respect to the connection between land back and climate justice, environmental justice. I want to, after the Chilcotin Nation decision came out, I was asked to write a legal opinion about it for a private client. But part of what I did this with Dr. Roshan Danesh. The two of us wrote this legal opinion talking about some of the basic dimensions of Aboriginal title. And as I went into and started to look into the sort of the roots of the way that the court may have been inspired and may have in terms of their articulation of the duty to future generations and what are described as in some way limits on the use of Aboriginal title, I think it's important for everyone to sort of grapple with that and understand that some of this stuff comes from kind of trust law, where the current generation of people are in a relationship with Aboriginal title that is trust-like, as opposed to a fee simple relationship which is one where a property owner can just run amok and do whatever and utterly destroy the land, completely use it, destroy it, do whatever they want. It's theirs to do whatever they want with. But I think that Aboriginal title, at least from the way that the judges crafted it, it is, first of all, it reflects Indigenous legal orders more, but also in terms of Western legal concepts, it comes more from trust law. And I think it may have been in part inspired by what in the American context is called the public trust doctrine. And this is where what it is it's a description of a state's relationship with state land, or in our context, a province's relationship with crown land, and what are the limitations. And so there's some interesting stuff there if people are interested to dig around and take a look at that. But the way that it's articulated, both in accordance with our own Indigenous legal orders and traditions, but also the common law of Aboriginal title and the duty to future generations, I think there's some very potentially powerful ideas there. And when I think about the landscape of British Columbia, and I think about the Forest Act changes that took place in 2002 and 3, where they effectively took what were public lands and made them more like quasi-private property and put them in the hands of forest companies, that they sent them off in this weird trajectory, where I think that the implementation of Aboriginal title will be a massive corrective measure that will localize the relationship of the territory to the people that live there, the people that have always lived there and other people that have come to live there with us, that it will become the framework for decision-making and benefits flowing from the landscape will be upended from what it currently is, where the province has handed away forests to companies that are run out of Toronto or New York or wherever, somewhere else down in the States, and where it's considered a commodity rather than a living, breathing entity that we're in necessary relationship with. So I think that when people think land back, they should be understanding the implications of that and how it can be beneficial to environmental justice and climate justice, because the decision-making framework in relation to Aboriginal title is very different from decision-making framework to private land or to crown land. There is an embedded obligation that Indigenous peoples have. It's like a doctrine of continuity. We have to safeguard and protect the Aboriginal title to ensure its continuity for future generations. That is a very important part of the way that the relationship is structured. And so I think there's a lot there in that. I don't know, I think maybe I'll just leave it at that. And I know there's a million different questions and comments about the Douglas treaties, and it's a whole topic to dive into, but we don't have time to do that today. But I think that overall, when we think about the land back concept and the idea and the need for Canada to get the land back to Indigenous peoples, its rightful owner, that this has to be understood as a positive step for the entire country, for all of us, a reparative step, a massive step towards justice. This will always be, until Canada, I think, has enormous potential to be a great country in the history of humanity. But it will never be that until it gets this stuff right that we're talking about. And if we do this, if we go down this path of seriously moving towards proper implementation and recognition of rights, and including title and land, that this will be a major step towards justice for all Canadians. And it will be of major benefit to the people of Canada overall. And it will be a major benefit to the environment and to the climate as well. So I'll just leave that with everyone. And I think what I feel one of the most important things I've said today is that these changes won't happen unless the people of Canada are driving them. This is not going to happen because some lawyer said this or that, or some politician said this or that. This work will only happen if it's made clear to the political leadership of this country that Canadians demand it, that Canadians believe it's a necessary step that we have to take together. that this is the world that we want to create for our children and grandchildren. It's a product of respect and dignity and Indigenous peoples being in the rightful relationship with themselves and their territories and with all other Canadians. So I think there's an enormous, we're in a moment where if we don't get this right, then the future will write, and historians will look back at this time and say, holy man, they had a real opportunity there and they blew it. I don't want to be a part of that storyline. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to get this right in this time that we're in. And future generations have expended their entire lives to build and to create and to structure this moment that we find ourselves in. We owe it both to our ancestors that brought us to this place and to future generations that will come after us to do what's right in this time. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion, to the David Suzuki Foundation and Aimée for leading the discussion, and everyone that's been a part of this. Thank you.
Ashka, Doug, and to all of you, this has been an incredibly rich discussion. I want to express gratitude to the David Suzuki Foundation for making this space, to Trevor and Panos for the technical support, to Marilyn and Rachel and Doug, and to you, all of the viewers who have participated. It's amazing to see this chat and the Q&A. Doug, I take you seriously when you say we have to get this right. This is a moment in time. It's a unique moment in time. And how do you do that? A lot of what we've shared today has been, you know, if you take it as a whole, might seem to be overwhelming. And I think it's in concrete actions, and it's in carrying on the conversation and the discussion and finding ways to deeply engage in ways that are going to engage into the future. And one of the things that I ask my students to do as part of their participation marks for class is to actually go engage in conversations outside of the classroom. So I'd like to offer that same, extend that same invitation to each of you who is participating here, is take this beyond this webinar. Engage with your loved ones, your colleagues, your friends, and the people who disagree with you and that you disagree with, in mutually respectful conversations about what has been shared today. I know that common themes that have come out of our conversation is working for future generations, our deep respect and love for the land. And from my perspective, you know, I take this conversation and I'm going to go offer this tobacco to the river that is just by my home here. And, you know, if we think of the enormity of getting this right, we can always ask for help, and asking the lands and waters for help in the work that we need to do, as what we say in an Anishinaabe tradition is, our work as pitiful human beings, then, you know, we should be asking for that help and extending, you know, what has been said in the videos is that hand, to the extending that hand and working together. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to work together. So thank you so much, Miigwech, to our panelists. Again, all of those of you who have attended, I look forward to continuing this conversation and look forward to the future that we will help build together. Miigwech, and take care, everyone. Be safe.